electrical analysis, which may be, I don't know, the topic you're most interested in. Probably the most useful. The question of the hour is, how do we determine how large of a battery bank a home needs to have in order to go off grid? We don't want to sell our customer an expensive solar system only to have them move into the home and their electricity not work. That might be all right for, I don't know, renewable advocate who's happy to, move into the mountains of Colorado and live in a yurt. But for a doctor, a wife, and 2 kids in middle school, they might not have the same ambition to connect so hard with nature and their solar arrays. It's actually kind of an interesting point. I know a guy, the guy who brought me into the industry, the guy who trained me, he now specializes in the hippie retirement plan, buying cheap land in the middle of nowhere, putting in tiny houses, small solar, small batteries. And we talk about design philosophy, and he says, it's amazing how little some people can get away with in terms of system size. A small battery, a small solar array might be perfectly fine for someone who's going to live in their unit and consciously manage their energy use. And it becomes kind of a game. Certainly when you move into an off-grid home, you are more aware of your electric use. So I would say the appetite for electrons for off-grid livers is smaller than for a grid-connected home, just inherently. But what we'll learn in our off-grid design is it's better to err on the side of caution and have too much electricity rather than too little. In fact, there's going to be certain months of the year, like in the springtime and the fall, when, simply put, you will have too much electricity. You'll have an overabundance of electricity. It's really the fall, the winter time months in particular, that you have to be careful. But often the customer does not have data that you can use to size their home. I mean, we do have smart meters, smart grid. These digital meters track our 15-minute by 15-minute electrical consumption. They should be able to tell us what our maximum power point is throughout the day. But that's only if the utility has unlocked that data. It's worthwhile to log into your electrical account and see if that data is available. But in my experience, customers, if they know anything about their electric use, they usually come to you with an electric bill that says, hey, here's a copy of my electric bill, and on your electric bill you might have a copy of a month-by-month printout of how much electricity you use, so you can kind of use this chart to kind of estimate your annual usage. So how do you know what maximum power your home is at when you only have monthly numbers? How do you know that every day your solar array is going to be filling up the battery bank with electricity? Well, you have to guess. And for that, we kind of go back to old school solar design. I got into solar in 2008, and we never did any of this stuff. This was like early 2000s, the 1990s approach to solar, where you make a survey of every device that's going to be in your home, and what the power ratings are, how much power they would draw if they were all on at one time. Well, actually, in National Electric Code, it's kind of the same thing. Well, let me get my drawing tools up. Or I guess I do have my laser pointer. So here we go. Now, National Electric Code is kind of the same thing. You're supposed to count up your electrical devices, and they do have assumptions within code to determine what the power rating of your service panel should be. And there's minimum sizes of your service panel. You know, and for the most part, for residential, National Electric Code says you have a minimum of 100 amps. And most residential homes are 200 amps. Some homes put in a 400 amp service panel. But by and large, that 200 amp service panel is grossly overrated. Now you look at 200 amps and it's a 240 volt electric service. That would mean you can push as much as 48 kilowatts of power through that service panel. And most homes are only going to be drawing, at a maximum in the summertime when the air conditioner clicks on and you have all these other devices going on, maybe 8 kilowatts. Look at it another way. You have a 48 kilowatt service panel, but it may only take a 10 kilowatt solar array to offset the entire electric bill. And that solar array is only on for 1/3 of the day. And so if your load is averaging, 3 kilowatts 24/7, and it takes a 10 kilowatt array for 1/3 of the day to be on to offset that load, it implies that your home average load is going to be much less than 48 kilowatts. It's going to be closer to 3 kilowatts, or maybe even less than that on your average power draw. And so how do you go from having some high kilowattage devices but a low average power draw to up to a 48 kilowatt service panel? How do you know what size of output do you need for your system? There's a solar design software out there. They're kind of the price leader on the high end for design software, called Aurora Solar. They have really good 3D modeling, and they're well suited for residential. They recently have upped their features for commercial and utility scale. But they have a tucked away kind of hidden feature that I think really helps you kind of understand what your load profile will look like, because it really does come down to what devices are electric versus non-electric. And keep in mind that the winter time is your main obstacle. When you're designing an off-grid home, perhaps the most important question is, well, how are you going to heat the home in the winter? And so what Aurora Solar does is they have a survey of like the heaviest hitting electrical devices. So they say, okay, well, what is your month-to-month electric bill? And you put in each month's numbers. And they say, okay, well, do you have a swimming pool? Do you have an electric vehicle? Are you cooking with electricity? Do you have an air conditioner? Some northern climates, they don't really have too much air conditioner load. Heating. Are you on electric heat or are you on gas heat? Are you on electric hot water? Now, I would say you have to be careful with tankless water heaters, because a tankless water heater can be up to 20 kilowatts. They're heavy electrical demand. I mean, they say, well, a tankless water saves you money on your electric bill. Well, that's in part because it uses fewer kilowatt hours than an electric tank that sits there all day hot and radiates heat, and it's a little less efficient. But say an electric tank water heater would operate at 2 kilowatts or 1 kilowatt for 24/7, whereas a tankless water heater operates at 20 kilowatts, maybe for the 15 minutes that you're taking a shower or running your dishwasher. And so even though it uses less energy kilowatt hours, it uses more power kilowatts. And now we have to be aware of both. So what kind of lighting do you use, LEDs versus incandescents? And they use this survey to develop a load profile, which is the shape of your electric use throughout the day. Now, your load profile, this is kind of a smoothed out load profile. Your true load profile is going to be jumping up and down. And this is just the average. So your true load profile has a lot more hysteresis in it than this. But what this really kind of hammers home is the seasonal effects of your heavy hitting electrical devices, whether it be heating, pictured in orange, or air conditioner, pictured in aqua. And of course, if I can get rid of my electric heat, if I'm using in Mississippi, what's popular is wood chip heating. We have plenty of trees in Mississippi. And so if in the wintertime I'm primarily heating my home with wood chip heating, all of this load may go away. And so I may in fact have a lower electrical load in the winter. It really comes down to, am I going to heat my home with electric heating or some other form of energy? Of course, not all sites have gas, not all sites have trees, so you are kind of limited to your environment. And of course, there's nothing wrong with electric heat. It may be that in the middle of the day now, you have a lot of solar power, and so you might have two heating systems, an electric auxiliary heat for when your batteries are full and you still have a surplus of amount of solar. It may not matter that electric heat is less efficient than gas heat because you have a surplus of solar in the middle of the day. So efficiency doesn't really matter when you have an overabundance of electricity. And so you may heat your home in the day with electric heat, have another form of heating at night. You may start experimenting with thermal mass. Say, okay, well, maybe I do have a tank water heater. And so I heat the tank of water. Maybe I have 2 tanks of hot water. Maybe I have 5 tanks of hot water. And what I want to do is put as much hot water into those tanks in the middle of the day and then do thermal exchange to heat my home at night. It's kind of an interesting kind of new way to think about efficiency and design, to say, you can be very inefficient in the middle of the day and then at nighttime you have to be much more efficient, or maybe not even using electricity, using thermal mass at that time. Well, what about these maximums? So here in the wintertime, we're seeing a maximum of around 6 to 8 kilowatts or 4 to 5 kilowatts in the summertime. What Aurora Solar is doing is they're taking your month by month by month by month by month electric bill, and based off the device survey, they're saying, okay, well, in the month of July, you use 2,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, and based off these devices in your home, the size of a typical load profile in your area is going to look like this. So this load profile in the summertime would translate to 2,000 kilowatt hours of electricity in the summertime. And this load profile in the wintertime would translate into 6,000 kilowatt hours of electricity in the wintertime. And so basically, by knowing your month-to-month electric bill and knowing what devices you're trying to power, the devices will give you your load profile, and the amount of kilowatt hours under the curve will basically move this curve up and down. And so it is possible to kind of take a guess at your electric use. And what I'll do when we get into our modeling is I don't really bother too much with the load profiles. I just kind of assume an average flat load profile and make sure that my calculations are conservative. And what we'll see is that, especially with lead acid batteries, your load jumping up and down makes the system less efficient. And so I know that. I know that by assuming a flat load profile, in some ways, it's going to be a not conservative, the opposite. I guess a liberal or a progressive estimate instead of a conservative or regressive estimate. But at the same time, I also have to realize that, yes, I am building an off-grid home, and my customers are going to be aware that they're going to be in an off-grid home, and they are going to, as much as they can, do load shifting and try and run the heater, the air conditioner on high in the middle of the day and try and match up the load to be more consistent with the solar production. And so I'm not going to worry. I'm not going to sweat the small stuff too much. I mean, I'm going to try and be conservative on my estimates, and maybe the hysteresis of your electrical load, that inefficiency will be offset by the customer's efforts to do some load shifting and get some of this load to occur in the middle of the day. It is useful if you have this interval data to look at it. And we talk about a class we're writing is commercial solar peakers. I did a load profile for a doctor's office in Colorado, and he was paying a few $1,000s a month in his electric bill, and it turned out that he didn't really even need a solar array or a battery. What he needed to do was turn his heater on at midnight instead of at 6 a.m. because he was waiting to heat his building until 6 a.m. and it was spiking his electric demand through the roof, and he was on a rate structure where the energy charges didn't matter. It was the demand charge that was the most important. And that's really for another class. And so, the types of questions you want to know is, well, do you have a gas or propane tank, or using gas heat, propane heat? It's not a bad idea to have a secondary heat source. Even if you're doing a large array, having that extra redundant heating source in the wintertime, so that when you do get a cloud system coming through, you can say, okay, well, it's cloudy, it's not sunny, so now I need to use my wood chip heat or my gas heat instead of my electric heat. Knowing that on sunny days or in days when your battery's in good health, you might be able to fully rely on your solar power. So this is regional specific. And the other thing to think about is not all loads are bad in off-grid. I mean, it may be, it's kind of weird, but if you're living off-grid, you don't necessarily need to be stingy with your appliances. I mean, it would be, to illustrate an extreme example, it would be better to have 4 refrigerators and 5 clothing dryers so that you could do all of your laundry right in the middle of the day when your solar array is productive. And with your refrigerators, you could have a beverage fridge, a fridge for storing your food, a fridge for frozen food, and then the fridge that you're using on a day-to-day use that might be just a mini fridge, which has your food for the day that you're opening and shutting on a regular basis. And so your deep freeze you're keeping shut, it might be that you put your deep freeze on a timer and really only run it during the day and let it coast at night. And because you're not opening and shutting the lid, it just kind of maintains its internal temperature. It might be better to take 4 refrigerators and fill the back half of those refrigerators with gallon jugs of water. Just put some thermal mass inside the refrigerator so that when you open and shut the doors of the fridges, you don't lose as much internal temperature of the refrigerator. And then those kinds of refrigerators could be put on a timer so that during the off-peak times, they're only running, a half an hour out of every hour. And then those internal jugs of water are chilling in the middle of the day during peak solar production. And so it's not necessarily that you need a tiny house with a very few appliances. It's that you need to be smart about your product selection. So here we are looking at our month-to-month consumption. In this case, we have kind of high winter consumption, lower consumption in March and April, and then even higher consumption in the summertime than we do in the wintertime. So this is kind of a typical load profile for a kind of small to mid-size home in the southern United States. And what these columns are to indicate is to say, okay, well, here's a couple of different design scenarios. You might have a 4 kilowatt solar array if you have a zero net metering policy. And a 4 kilowatt solar array would not produce hardly any outflow under this circumstance. But at the same time, it would only offset about 1/3 of your electric bill. Well, that's not very much fun. A 4 kilowatt array would also be quite expensive to install. Maybe it would have the lowest upfront capital cost, but it would have that highest dollar per watt install value. In our intro to solar class, we talk about real estate values in solar, and actually on smaller projects, even though the install costs are higher and that makes the payback longer, more value is retained in a small project as far as real estate value goes than a larger project. So there are kind of ways that, if you're just burning to buy a solar array and you only have, $10,000 and you get a quote for a 4 kilowatt system, there are ways to justify it, even though the payback may be out into the future. Or you could go into a 7 kilowatt project, which that would produce a decent amount of outflow if you didn't have net metering of any type. Maybe it's justifiable because that's a good kind of one pallet size modules. 7 kilowatts tends to have pretty good economies of scale to it compared to 4 kilowatts. And so that might be something that doesn't produce a surplus on a month-by-month basis. So in the wintertime, you're only offsetting about half your bill. In the summertime, you're only offsetting about half your bill. But also in the spring and fall, you're not producing a surplus. And so if you have a month-to-month net metering plan, a 7 kilowatt would be kind of sized as to not produce any outflow. But again, it doesn't offset 100% of your bill. It only offsets about half of your electric bill. If you wanted to do 100%, you could do a 12.5 kilowatt array. And so if you had an annual net metering plan, and there are some nuances to this that we're not going to get into, but you need about 12.5 kilowatts to produce as much as what you consume. And if you had a unlimited net metering program, then that would be a good system size for a grid-tied home. With an off-grid home, it's a little bit different in that you need to oversize the DC capacity. And you're not really trying to oversize in the spring and fall. You really don't care about the spring and fall. What you want to do is make sure that you're producing enough power to offset every single month. And so you want to make sure that in January, you're producing as much power as you're consuming. In February, you're producing as much as you're consuming. And March and April and May, you're gonna just blow past the goalposts in those months. So it's almost in March and April and May, you don't even have to think about your fact that you live off grid because you're just going to be having so much electricity anyway. And then in June and really once you get into the summertime months, you have to be a little bit more aware that you're just barely producing as much as you're consuming. And so with off-grid design, we have to be much more aware of summertime and wintertime, and then spring and fall don't really matter. Whereas if we don't have net metering, it's kind of the opposite way around. Is in spring and fall, that's when we have most of our outflow, and that becomes kind of problematic. Now, at the same time, we are doing a much larger solar array, so of course, we're going to be producing more energy. And I would just keep in mind that an 18 kilowatt array is not necessarily let's see, not very good multiples here. Let's see, an 18 kilowatt array is not 4 times as expensive as a 4 kilowatt array. There are economies of scale here. And so I just did kind of a pricing range where you might get 18 kilowatts for $2 a watt. And this is just without the batteries, okay? So this is just to kind of do a comparative analysis of the solar scope of this project. So forget about the batteries for a minute. 18 kilowatts at $2 a watt would be $36,000. 12.5 kilowatts at $2.50 a watt would be $31,000. 7 kilowatts, $2.75, $19,000. And then our cheapest array, 4 kilowatts at $3.50 a watt, would be $14,000. But you end up getting a substantial discount to do the large 18 kilowatt array rather than the smaller arrays. The 18 kilowatt array having the best dollar per watt price. When you're grid connected, you might not be able to, as we just talked about in the previous section, buy an array that large, because when you're just getting compensated at 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour, it's just not going to be worthwhile. So it's a little bit of a different design choice in off-grid, where you're grossly oversizing the solar array. So what that means is your solar array, because it's designed to offset your January electric use, and because it's designed to offset your July and August electric use, we're producing on an annual basis, we're producing far more than what our home is consuming on an annual basis. So when you're doing like a net metered solar array with 100% net metering, what we can see is our off-grid array is going to be maybe another 50% larger than a 100% net metered array. Something to think about if you're in the solar industry and you want to know how to get into larger and larger projects. Go into off-grid. You start doing larger and larger projects. Okay, what about those cloudy winter days? How much power is our solar array producing on a cloudy winter day? And one thing I want to start with is that there's a huge difference in cloudy days. I mean, when you have a cloudy day with just kind of a haze and it's kind of overcast but still bright outside, you still get pretty decent production out of your array. It's only when the clouds are much more thick that the production plummets. And so you might think of your winters as being cloudy, but that might not give you the right impression on if you have sunny winters or not with regards to the electrical output of the system. And thankfully, our friend PV Watts, that's been with us in the solar industry, telling us how much power our array can produce for decades now. It has this hourly output that will help us determine how much our array is producing in cloudy weather. And so here we've done our PV Watts calculation, and we've gone to the very end of the calculation where it tells us how much annually we're producing and how much month by month we're producing. And then we've gone and kind of matched up our array to say, okay, how large of an array do I need to offset both July and January in terms of production? And so we run our PV Watts calculation and download our hourly data. And here's a picture of our hourly data. And what we can see in this example, here we are on January 1st. at midnight and there's no sun in the sky and our solar array is not doing anything either, that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Well, here it's 7 a.m. and we see the sun's coming up and we also see our array turning on. Then it gets to be 8, 9, and then there's more radiance in the sky. And here we go all the way up to January 1st at high noon. We get almost up to 1,000 watts per metered square, which is the amount of sunlight in the test condition that a solar array should be getting on its surface. Except our module is not directly facing the sun in this circumstance. So PV watts translates beam irradiance, direct sunlight, and diffuse irradiance, which is how much sun is getting kind of deflected by humidity, clouds, water vapor, air pollution. And it translates that into an array irradiance, which is how much sunlight is getting through the atmosphere, and based off the tilt angle and orientation, how much of that sunlight is hitting the surface of our modules. And so what this picture illustrates is that we're getting between the beam irradiance and diffuse irradiance on January 1st at high noon, we're getting about 1,000 watts per meter squared of sunlight, and 850 watts per meter squared are hitting our module that's south facing at a 20-degree tilt or whatever. And then we get to our system output. What I wanted to point out is you scroll down in PV watts, eventually you're going to get to a day that looks like this. So in the previous example, we're mostly beam irradiance with very little diffuse irradiance. And what we can see here is we have almost zero beam irradiance and only diffuse irradiance, at least in the morning. And then the sun starts to peak back out at 1 and then goes behind the clouds and peaks out a little bit at 3 and then goes back behind the clouds. And we're mostly at diffuse irradiance. And so if you want to know what the array is going to produce when there's no kind of direct sunlight at all, when it's that very thick, cloudy day that you think of as a gray, dark winter day, PV watts will tell you. And so we see that normally on a sunny winter day, we're producing 600, 700 watts out of the solar array. And then on that same kind of angle of the sun, same kind of temperature of the module, under full clouds, instead of getting 600 watts, we're getting 30 or 90. So we're producing 5 to 15% of what we would be producing on a sunny day on that very cloudy day. But what about on an overcast day? Not where the clouds are thick, but overcast. Well, here we see an example where our direct irradiance is 183 and our diffuse irradiance is 231. And now we're producing 300 watts instead of 660. And that's not that bad. I mean, that says on an overcast day, we might be producing half of what the module would be producing on a sunny day. It's just when those clouds are just a little bit more thick is when that production really begins to plummet. And so if you think that you have clouds every single day in the wintertime, you still might be all right to go off grid with solar. It really is to what degree how thick are the clouds, and you can use PV watts to assess that. And so what I would point out is that solar installers, they, in my experience, overcast days produce far more power than what solar installers assume. solar installers just kind of assume that on cloudy days, a solar array is going to be doing 20% or 10% or 15% what it does on a sunny day, when it can be 40%. And so here we've plotted our data in Excel from PV Watts, because PV Watts is going to be giving us a system output for every hour in the day. So we've created an Excel file for every hour of the year, and we can see January 1st is a sunny day, sunny day, sunny day, and then our partly cloudy day, our production is still okay. Sunny day, a little bit more cloudy, followed by a sunny day, and then we go into a weather system that would really be those thick gray snow clouds coming in and ruining the production of our array. And so we go 1, 2, 3, 4 days without the sun. And then the bottom example is, well, one solution might be to do twice as much solar. So let's say solar panels are not nearly as expensive as they used to be. In fact, nowadays it might be that your inverter system for an off-grid costs as much or more than the solar panels themselves. Solar just gets getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, even with the import tariffs. And so you could say, well, what happens if I just buy twice as much solar? Will that reduce the size of my battery bank? And the answer is, well, it's not so simple. Yes, if you double the size of your solar array, you're going to see these peaks get a little bit taller, and so you're going to get a little bit more production out of an array that's twice the size on those days. But we have to remember that it's getting twice as much production when you're down at 5% of what it would be doing, or 7% of what it would be doing under full sun. Getting 14% instead of 7% is not that much. You're better to hunker down and just wait for the sun to come back out. And so what we'll do in our design is look at how can we determine what size of our array is actually getting us through those overcast cycles versus what size of battery bank do we really need. And kind of the variable that I key it into is, well, what are you doing when you don't have solar on your site? You're usually using a backup generator for gas. And so a little bit later on in the program, we'll conclude that basically you build your PV Watts model out, and then you add a column for doing your battery size, and then you model your generator runtime and look at the price of gas for your generator runtime and use that hard dollar value to determine, okay, well, I'm spending $600 a year on gas for my generator. And so if I increase my solar array so large or increase my battery bank so large, how much do I reduce off my gas consumption to kind of make that decision? So your generator runtime is the real kind of pivot point. If you double your array size to reduce the size of the battery, basically what you're going to do is fill up your battery faster. And so what happens when you have a full battery and your array is still productive? Well, you're going to clip the top of your production off. Now, this is in the utility scale terms. When they have too much production from their power plants and not enough consumption, you get into stranded energy that just kind of sits there and isn't, it's burnt up, it's wasted. They might actually pay you to take it, so that if you buy this much power, we'll give you this much free. You get into negative energy pricing, at least for that instant in time, for that stranded energy. So you don't want too much stranded energy, and doubling the size of your array is going to give you a lot of stranded energy on those sunny days. So doubling the size of your array to get you through the cloudy days really isn't going to be the best strategy. A better strategy most of the time is going to be to expand the size of your battery bank to get you through that extremely overcast system. And so what we want to do is use some kind of model to figure out your consumption on an hourly basis for every hour of the day, and figure out your production for every hour of the day, and use that to develop what size of a battery bank do we need. And as far as your consumption goes, you may not have your hourly consumption figures, but you do have your monthly figures. You divide by your monthly figures by your days in the month and then hours of the day, and all of a sudden you have a average hourly consumption. And so if your goal is to consume 1 day's worth of power out of the battery and then fill it back up with 1 day's of solar array, you can assume an even flat load profile and build your model off that. No, it's not perfect. Yes, a perfectly flat load profile is going to assume a more efficient system than what you'll get when your load's jumping up and down. And so we're going to have to assume that the rest of our model is going to be so conservative to overcome that assumption. So what we see here is not PV watts, but Energy Toolbase. This is more of a commercial modeling software. But so what it's modeling is the battery state of charge, how much your solar array is putting into the battery to drive it up to a full state of charge, and then how much you're using the battery. So you can use Energy Toolbase to perform off-grid calculations, or at least to get you started on your system sizes. And so here what we see is in the winter time, so this is in January, our battery is up at full state of charge, and then it's dropping down and then going back up and then dropping down and then going back up and then dropping, and kind of maintaining an even amount of flow, and then coming back down and going up, and then eventually it starts climbing back up again and then fully recovers all the way up to the start. And what would likely happen is instead you reduce the size of your battery bank, and then instead of running out of energy down here at the bottom, you would turn on a generator to charge you all the way back up to the top. And so that's when we'll see how it develops into our model. You can take how many times you have to run the generator in order to recharge the solar array before you get back into this cycle where the solar array can recover the battery between your periods of overcast weather. And so there are some overcast days where the clouds aren't very thick. And on those overcast days where the clouds are not very thick, doubling the size of your array would turn that overcast day into a sunny day. But then there's also overcast days where the clouds are so thick that doubling the size of your array doesn't do you any good at all. And it's really those multi-day critical times that you need to get through, not the overcast days where your battery, it doesn't fully recharge, it just kind of treads water in the middle of its range. That's not the bad day. The bad days is when you get no charge out of your solar array at all for a couple days in a row, and it drains all the way down. So you can have 1 day where you don't get much solar production if the days before it and the days after it have good solar production. It's when you go through an extended period where you have thick clouds, kind of overcast day, thick clouds, overcast day, thick clouds, and that battery state of charge keeps going down and down and down. That's, you hit the bottom, and that's when you need to turn the generator back on. What we'll see when we talk about generators later on in the discussion is that gas is a very expensive way to generate electricity. Gasoline is more expensive than propane and natural gas, but even propane and natural gas for generating electricity through a home generator is expensive. And of course, you can run out of gas and propane too. So, gas, natural gas, propane, gasoline, no matter what your fuel resource is, unless you're like getting real into homesteading, where you're doing like anaerobic digesters or biodiesel and generating your own fuel resource on site. And this is not, we're not trying to turn every off-grid customer into, that kind of solar user. Generally speaking, you don't want to have to rely on the generator to get you through the winter. The idea is, I'll use the solar array for 11 months out of the year, but in the winter time, I'll be running the generator 24/7. That can be very expensive, and all the savings of those meter fees, it would be better to just stay grid connected and not have a generator. Use your grid connection to get you through the winter instead of a gas generator. I mean, you don't want to trade a cheap grid connection for an expensive gas bill just so you can be off grid. And also keep in mind that you got to transport that gas to site. And so if you're in a disaster and then you run out of gas, which does happen, then you're out of electricity. And so we really want to get our design to the point where the generator is purely for backup, where we're only needing to run the generator a couple of times a year so that we're not just spending money hand over fist on our gas bill. And because of that, because we designed the system not to rely on the generator, the fuel resource of the generator begins to matter a little bit less, because you're not using much of it. You're not using much gasoline. Even if gasoline is more expensive than propane or natural gas, it might be a little bit easier, if it's like a vacation cottage, to just dispense with the gas line or the propane tank and just know every time you're coming out to the cottage, you might want to fill up a portable tank of gas and take it with you. That might be easier than incorporating gas and gas appliances into the building scope. So kind of the conclusion is we want the battery and the solar array to be large enough to get through the winter time. And some of that might also be to spend a little bit of time thinking about how to clear snow off of the array, particularly if you live up north. I mean, I'm doing work in Mississippi, and we really don't get much snow in the winter. There are areas in the North United States where you get snow, 4 months out of the year you could get snow. In those areas, I would encourage you to be innovative about how to melt snow off of the array. If you're grid tied, you might not want to. If you melt snow off of an array in the wintertime, you're going to create water on your roof, and that's going to create ice and cause ice dams. I don't think there's been a lot of thought put into how to heat the solar array on the roof enough to melt the snow off. But certainly, even if you're running the heater and that's using electricity to melt the snow off the array, and you do that and then the sun comes up, you're going to generate more electricity than what you put into melting the snow off the surface. It might be that would be a reason to go with a ground mount, where you can broom the snow off of the array. May also be a reason to put some solar modules hanging down the side of your building so that the snow just can be easily knocked off of the array, and then you can use that electricity to heat the rooftop. But if you are melting snow off of the array, you also want to put some thought into how to collect that water so that it doesn't just sit underneath your flashing. Anyway, let's get back to the model. So what we've done is we've gone into PV watts and we've picked out an array size so that for every month of the year, we are producing more power than what we're consuming with our solar array. And we're just assuming that the spring and fall, that's the worry-free months where, you can just use all the electricity you want without having to worry about it. And then in the summertime and the wintertime, you have to be a little bit more aware of your electricity use. Then what we want to do is take our monthly consumption and divide by the number of days in the month, divide by the number of hours in the day, to get an hourly average consumption figure. And when we learn about batteries, we'll learn about discharge rates. If we hit that 24-hour completely flat average consumption figure, that's going to be analogous to a C20 discharge rate. So there's going to be more on that later. Load shifting will kind of overcome the hysteresis of saying, well, we're not actually going to hit a stable load. Okay, that's true, and that's going to insert inefficiency into the system. At the same time, we may not be drawing as much energy out of our battery bank either, because we can do some load shifting and put more consumption into the middle of the day when the solar array is on. And so our system becomes less efficient because we're not hitting this stable load, and then it becomes more efficient because we do some load shifting, and then we hope that by being conservative with the rest of our assumptions, it all balances out. The main thing that you want to do is avoid spiky loads. Like, okay, well, if you are going to have a tankless water heater, the way you would use a tankless water heater is to run it only in the very middle of the day to supercharge a hot water tank. You don't use it at 3 a.m. at night. What you want is to have already heated the water that you need by that point in time. So here we've gone from our monthly consumption to days in the month, to how many kilowatt hours per day we're consuming, to how many kilowatts per hour we're consuming. And so we see that for this electric load, we're consuming, an average of about 2 kilowatts per hour. And of course, that's going to go up and it's also going to go down. So what that means is maybe in the middle of the night, we're only using 500 watts of electricity. And maybe when you're running your laundry and the air conditioner kicks on and you're also cooking dinner, your load spikes up to maybe 4 or 5 times that amount, maybe to 6 kilowatts. And then you're also going to have some kinds of loads that are going to use 2 or 3 times the amount of electricity to start the load as they do operating the load. And so if you're running your laundry and running the air and going at full load at 6 kilowatts and an air conditioner clicks on, that might spike your load momentarily all the way up to 12 kilowatts, and then your load might drop back down to 8 kilowatts after that. And so knowing this average number will kind of help you scale, and we've seen Aurora Solar kind of scale your load profile based off these monthly production figures. So then what we're going to want to do is go back into our PV watts hourly production figures. Remember, that's available as a download in the PV watts section. And so we're taking our AC system output, which is measured in watts, And then we take this figure, which is our average kilowatts per hour, and we go ahead and add that into the PV Watts Excel file. And so here we have our system output and our hourly consumption. And so if we subtract the two, we get how much power is going into our batteries and how much power is coming out of our batteries. And so here we have 90 watts going in and 2,000 watts coming out. We have 0 watts going in and 2,000 watts coming out. We have 605 watts going in and 2,000 watts coming out. So this day in the winter time, we're going to experience a loss. We're consuming far more than what we're producing. And so we have to say, well, how then do we make sure we don't run out of power if we're consuming more than we're producing? Well, then we have to add an additional column to the model, which is our battery size. And so here, I've created a column. We have our AC output, or our AC input, our solar array charging the battery, our consumption coming out of the battery, and then our battery level. And so at that point, we just have to kind of guess a starting level for the battery. So, what I recommend as a starting size for a battery would be 90 kilowatt hours to 120 kilowatt hours. And basically because you get much larger than that, and the batteries start to get much more expensive, or even beyond the capabilities of a standard industrial flooded lead acid battery bank that's 2 circuits. And you really want your batteries to be no more than 2 circuits. Schneider says, well, and Hawker, the battery manufacturer I use, they say, well, 3 circuits is not unusual, but any more than that, what happens is it's very important for the battery circuit lengths, the physical lengths of cable, to be exactly the same, so that the resistance in the cable is exactly the same, so that the battery cells degrade at the same age. And so generally speaking, you only want to have like 2 circuits of batteries, because you can put them right next to each other and the cable lengths will be exactly the same. You get into 3 and 4. You have to keep in mind these are big battery banks. We'll look at the size in a little bit, but by one battery bank, I'm talking about like 16 square foot of real estate in your control room. You put in a whole bunch of those, and now you have a giant control room on your hands, and getting all the cables to be the right size and lengths, and have those lengths be short and resistance free, is a physical challenge. And so what we're doing is starting and kind of assuming our battery bank is going to be 120 kilowatt hours. And so we have no production minus 2 kilowatts per hour of consumption. Our battery bank drops down to 118, then 116, then 114, 112, 110, 108. And then the solar array starts to turn on and kind of slow down the loss. Now, you have to be a little bit of you have to have a little bit of experience, basic introductory experience to Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets. They have spreadsheets now. And so what I've done here is I've put in a formula that it does a couple of things. One, it converts the watts to kilowatts so that we're using the same units here. But I've also done an if statement that basically says if the battery size is less than 120 kilowatt hours, then keep subtracting or adding to it. But our maximum size is 120 kilowatt hours. So if you have to go in and change this formula so that when it charges back up, It doesn't charge above and beyond 120 kilowatt hours because that's the maximum that it can be. So, what happens is when the batteries are full and the solar array is still capable of charging, that's just stranded electricity. You can't do anything with it. You can do some stuff with it if you program things, but that comes a little bit later. So the other thing that I recommend doing is, so now we have a cell that's where we're guessing the size of our battery bank. We're starting at 120 kilowatt hours and then subtracting, and then here we see our array getting, starting to wake up a little bit. This column that I've done here is for a 1 kilowatt solar array. And I actually recommend when you do your PV watts model, not starting out with a specific system size like 18 kilowatts and then downloading the data. I recommend starting out with a 1 kilowatt solar array and then adding an additional column where it's a scalar. And so here I have a cell where I put in my array size for 18, and then what it's doing is it's taking the output column of a 1 kilowatt array and multiplying it by 18. And so we go from 90 watts to 1.6 kilowatts because our array size is an 18 kilowatt array. And that'll allow you just to put in like a 14 kilowatt array and then a 20 kilowatt array and a 30 kilowatt array and see how far down the battery level gets in terms of its minimum battery size. And we'll do an example, let you know what I'm talking about. But what you'll see is as you might get up to 18 kilowatts, and then you put in a 20 kilowatt array, and then you put in a 25 kilowatt array, and the minimum battery bank level doesn't budge. And the reason is the very next day, the sun comes out, and it doesn't matter if it's an 18 kilowatt array or a 20 kilowatt array, it starts climbing that battery depth of discharge all the way back up to the top, and you've already hit your end of the year low. And it may be that by increasing the size of your array, that end of the year low doesn't get any shallower simply because you hit that end of the year low because of thick overcloud days where you're producing such little electricity that the size of the solar array doesn't really matter because you're only outputting 5% of what it would be doing under full sun. And so there, by just kind of fiddling around and guess and checking, you can start to kind of intuitively hone in on what a proper array size is before the array size starts to not make as much of an impact onto that minimum battery level. Now here in this cell, what we've done is we've started with a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank, and then we've run a little search function called a minimum function to determine what is the lowest depth of discharge or the lowest battery level that we get to, and we get to negative 241 kilowatt hours, which that in reality that wouldn't work. You wouldn't have a battery that has negative energy in it, or if you do, scientists would be kind of interested in what you've discovered. The next step to this model is to go into those days where you start getting into that lowest battery level and turning the generator on and charging it all the way back up to the top. So once we get through this whole process, we'll go in and do an example. So here I'm kind of honing in on my array size, and I say, okay, well, 18 kilowatt array is okay, but I'm going to go and do a 22 kilowatt array, because with an 18 kilowatt array, I'm getting down to negative 241. And then if I do a 22 kilowatt array, I only get down to a negative 122. And so by just as easy as tacking on another 4 kilowatts of solar to my battery bank, I substantially reduce the minimal level of my battery by adding just that much more solar. You know, an extra 4 kilowatts every single day is enough to substantially, you know, reduce that number. And that tells me that 22 kilowatts is a little bit better than 18. Now, when I'm picking my numbers, I'm usually kind of going in multiples of 7, or whatever one pallet of solar modules is coming out to be. Right now, it's one pallet of 60 cell solar modules is about 7.5 kilowatts. And so I'm modeling a 15 kilowatt array, and then a 22.5 kilowatt array, and then like a 20 or 9 or 30 kilowatt array, and just going by telling my customers, you're either going to do 1 pallet, 2 pallets, 3 pallets, you know, in extreme cases, 4 pallets of solar modules. That makes it easier on shipping logistics to order by the pallet. You do the same thing with your minimum battery size. You know, you can go and say, okay, well, if I have a 90 kilowatt hour or 120 kilowatt hour, you'll see the numbers in your model adjust up and down. You know, mainly because it can't charge back beyond 90 kilowatts. So if you go with a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank, you can charge all the way up to 120. If you go with a 90 kilowatt hour battery bank, your starting point's a little bit lower, and so you're going to run out of energy that much faster. Now, you know, just as a side note, when you're buying 120 kilowatt hours worth of flooded lead acid batteries, it just coincidentally all fits on one pallet, and that one pallet is going to weigh 4,000 pounds. And most residential lift gates can only weigh 3,000 pounds. And so here it's actually half that. It's 60 kilowatt hours, weighs about 4,000 pounds. And this would be 2 pallets. And so a 90 kilowatt hour lead acid battery bank would get you 2 pallets of 3,000 pounds each, and they would fit all the way down the lift gate. Now, that's just some logistical stuff, but it is something important to keep in mind, is to check your pallet weights before you order, because you don't want to get into an instance where you don't have the right equipment needed to where you can't offload the material off the truck. And, you know, if it gets to the point where you have to rent a $750 piece of equipment just to offload the batteries off the truck because they can't go down the lift gate, you know, you might rather instead spend that money on your battery bank or on the additional shipping needed to have them come in 3 pallets instead of 2. Or so this is kind of repeating what we've said already. You know, going from a 22 kilowatt array to a 28 kilowatt array, we see the minimum battery level go from minus 122 to minus 94. That's a 30 kilowatt hour difference. That's not a huge effect on this like battery deficit number. I guess I did this wrong. This should be 14 or 15 kilowatts, not 28. I guess I did that graphic wrong. But if instead of doing a 22 kilowatt array, we had done a 15 kilowatt array, we'd see this minimum battery level in our number kind of drop off the floor. And so you do see kind of if it's a 2 pallet system or a 3 pallet system or a 4 pallet system, we see that the difference between 2 pallets of solar modules and 3 pallets of solar modules is a huge difference in our battery deficit, which is just kind of a fictitious number that helps us hone in on our optimal array size. the difference between a 3 pallets of solar and 4 pallets of solar, the battery deficit number is not that big. And at that point, it might be that we have to look at our battery size or our generator size to overcome that difference. Oh, there we go. So here I've gone from a 22 kilowatt array to a 22 kilowatt array. And all I've done is take the battery size from 90 kilowatt hours up to 120 kilowatt hours. And what I can see is that my battery level, I've increased my battery size by 30 kilowatt hours, and my minimum battery level has only increased by 30 kilowatt hours. So, increasing the battery size by 30 kilowatt hours at this point doesn't seem to have any obvious benefit. Same thing with the larger array, going from 90 to 122, increasing the battery bank size by 30 kilowatt hours doesn't have any obvious benefit. Increasing the storage capacity of the battery doesn't have any obvious benefit. So this kind of battery deficit number is really driven by the size of the solar array. The way we hone in on the right size of our battery bank is going to be to look at the generator runtime, which we'll get into in a little bit. So here's what our Excel model now looks like. Is that we're discharging the day throughout the night, recharging it when the sun comes up, discharging it, recharging it, discharging it, recharging it. This is at a 90 kilowatt hour battery bank. Well, then we hit a period where the sun doesn't come out. So on this day, there's no sun. On this day, there's less sun. On this day, there's absolutely no sun. And then we get to the day where finally the sun comes back up. And then we get to a really sunny day, followed by another really sunny day, and we're all the way back up to the top. Well, guess what? This is the point right here where we're out of electricity. So all this down here, that's fictitious. This is just to help us fine-tune our numbers. We would be out of power at this point. Here's another stormy system right after it where we go through 1, 2 days without sun, and we can see that we went through we went through 1, 2, 3 days without sun, and that killed us. But going just 1, 2 days without sun, we were able to recover the battery before we ran out of juice. And now really we're going to be protecting our battery. These industrial flooded lead acid are rated all the way down to 80% depth of discharge. So on a 90 kilowatt hour battery bank, we would crank them at 18 kilowatt hours. It's like, well, could you crank them at 40 kilowatt hours instead of 18? The answer is yes. Is it better to crank it at 40 kilowatt hours instead of 18? The answer is maybe. These batteries with lead acid, they have a range in them. They have a top of the battery range. They have an elastic range in the middle. And then they have a bottom range where if you're in that range, you really want to get out of it as quickly as you can, because that bottom range is where the battery, even though it might be rated to operate there, even though you could discharge this battery down to 10% and back up again, that in this case, anywhere below 80%, the battery shouldn't be operating in that. And that's where industrial flooded lead acid, when you get into solar batteries or renewable batteries, they're actually worse than industrial, and they should only be discharged down to about 50%. And then you get into deep cycle lead acid batteries, they really should only be discharged down to about 30%. And then you get into golf cart batteries, and they really shouldn't even be discharged more than 20%. So it's like, well, there's a huge range in battery differences that we'll talk about a little later. I like industrial flooded lead acid because you can discharge it so deeply before needing to recharge it. And so what you see is here's a day where our 90 kilowatt hour battery bank is just fine, and solar's able to recover it without cranking the generator. And here's another system where we were right on the edge, but the solar array was able to recover it without cranking the generator. Whereas in this particular cycle, we would have had to crank the generator. So we're going to have to crank the generator maybe twice during this time frame. And then maybe it'll crank right here or not. Maybe it'll crank right here or not. What we'll see a little bit later is that we can actually start counting how many times our system would turn the generator on, how long would the generator run, and we can assign a hard dollar and cent value to that figure. We go look at March and April, and we're going to get rainy days and we're going to get cloudy days, but by and large, our electrical load's down and our solar production's up. And so even though we do get in some days where we get down near the bottom of our battery bank, it's never enough to turn the generator on. So, the thing is, at 90 kilowatt hours in March and April, the battery bank is well sized. But adding another 30 kilowatt hours would really make it worry-free, where you're not even getting near the bottom of the battery capacity. So, maybe 90 kilowatt hours is fine in this circumstance. We haven't gone in and calculated the generator runtime yet. The summer is okay too. Now our daily cycles are getting a little bit deeper than they were in the March and springtime. But again, our days are getting longer and we get more energy out of our array. So, May through September is looking pretty good. You get one little storm system right here, where you get some excessive thunderstorms, but, no big deal. So then we get back in towards the winter time, and we see this one period where we go like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days before we get into sunny weather. Another period where we get down to the bottom, another period where we get down to the bottom, and then another day where we go 1, 2, 3, this day is not good enough. You just kind of tread water, kind of an overcast day. So let's just call it 4. Another little overcast day, 5 days before we get into a sunny day pattern that could recharge our battery and recover it. And so what we need to do at this point, where we say, okay, well, we're pretty sure that a 22 kilowatt array is the right size for the PV. And remember, we got that figure because we went and said, okay, a 15 kilowatt array, our battery deficit, that minimum, which is pictured right here, how low do we go in our fictitious energy? At 15 kilowatts, we get all the way down to minus 760. At 22 kilowatts, we get to 122. And then at 28 kilowatts, we only get to 94. So that's not... that's a difference of 30 versus a difference of 630. So going from 2 pallets to 3 pallets, we have a difference of 630. Going from 3 pallets to 4 pallets, we only have a difference of 30. So 22 kilowatts is about the right size of our solar array. Now the question is, well, do we go with a 90 kilowatt hour battery bank, or do we go with a 122 kilowatt hour battery bank? And we still don't really know the answer to that just yet. So what we have to do is then expand our model to emulate what will happen when the generator runs. Now, you're able to program these generators not to run the battery all the way up to the top. It might be that when it gets down to 80%, you program it to run only up to 40%. And that's going to be more efficient than saying, okay, run it all the way up to 100% charge. The reason is you'd use half the gas, and maybe you get into that sunny weather where the sun then takes over and recovers it. At the same time, you're listening to your generator turn on and run twice instead of once, so it depends on how serene you want to be and how worry-free you want to be too. The only thing wrong with fully recharging your batteries with the generator is simply the amount of gas that it takes to do it. So there's a real cost. You know, when you're running your generator, that's the most expensive electricity. So you want to avoid running it as much as possible. And so here we take our model. Again, we have our PV bots output, our scaler for our solar array to get to our solar array output, our hourly consumption, our battery levels starting at 90 kilowatt hours, then being subtracted down. And then we finally get to our 20% left in our battery, and we say, okay, well, now the generator is going to turn on. And so if I have a 15 kilowatt generator, it's going to turn on at 15 kilowatts and charge that battery back up. And the next hour, it's running at 15 kilowatts and charging the battery back up. And then it's running for another 15 kilowatts and charging the battery back up. And so this number, generally what I'm going to do is go kind of type it in manually. I don't really use an Excel formula to go put it in, although you could. And so what this column will tell me is how many hours I'm running my 15 kilowatt generator at full capacity. And so I can actually determine how many hours a year in order to keep my 90 kilowatt hour battery bank from running out of juice. I would need to run my generator for 48 hours at full capacity. And what we'll see later is you can look up the spec sheet on your generator to see how much gas it's going to consume at what output capacity. And then from that point, you can calculate how much it actually costs to do that. And so what I'll do at that point is evaluate the cost to run the generator when my battery bank is 90 kilowatt hours versus the cost to run the generator when the battery bank is 120 kilowatt hours. And then based on the economics, make a choice on what's the best size for my system. And that's going to vary case by case based on the consumption output. And also, to some extent, how much money the client has to spend. And also, to another extent, how much are they willing to make adjustments, say, in the wintertime when the cloudy weather rolls in. Are they going to, how much are they going to cut back on their electricity use during that time? Are they happy not cooking dinner and just eating granola bars? Or are they, are they going to park the electric vehicle and drive the gas vehicle? Are they going to set the thermostat 60 instead of 68? So what lifestyle adjustments are they going to make during that period of critical low battery use? I don't like having to require customers to make lifestyle adjustments because I figure I want to make sure that they're going to be comfortable. And then what happens if they do make those lifestyle adjustments and their battery bank is too large? Well, what happens is if you oversize a battery, and so you install a battery that is 25% larger than it really needed to be, it's going to last 25% longer. You know, it's not like oversizing an inverter where you oversize the inverter and you just spent more money than you had to. It's not like that at all. It's your batteries have a limited cycle life in them, and they degrade primarily due to usage. And so if you're not using your battery as much because it's larger, it's going to last longer. So, you know, when you err on the side of conservatism, that's when you get a flooded lead acid battery that on paper, maybe it'll only last 12 years, but realistically, it could last 20. You know, because it was well sized to begin with conservatively, and then the model came in at less than that. Certainly there are customers who are limited by budget. It's those customers that need to much more carefully manage their electric use. You know, and at that point, then they really need to start thinking about their wintertime heating methods, saying, okay, well, we're going to go to wood chip heat, or we're going to make sure we do a lot of geothermal so that we can store our heat in the ground and take it up to the surface during the day. So this actually kind of, maybe we know a little bit more about our sizing to say that stranded energy occurs in off-grid. The generator is only going to be there kind of playing free safety for a few hours a year. And what we'll learn in the generator cost analysis is we eventually went and made this a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank instead of a 90, because the generator costs $600 a year to run at the 48-hour full capacity runtime. And so it only costs us $6,000 to go from a 90 kilowatt hour battery bank to a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank. And so it was worth it to upgrade the size of the battery and substantially reduce the generator runtime. So what we've learned is there's going to be times in your off-grid system where you have an overabundance of electricity. We've learned that you really don't want to rely on the generator for backup. We've learned that there's some mismatch between making assumptions about load profiles, but also there's some opportunities for load shifting that can kind of cancel each other out. And you know, other user priorities like the upfront cost of the batteries are going to play into the design. And total storage capacity, you know, the peace of mind. You know, that's you don't want to move your customer into a home that's going to be stressful. And so, you know, if they aren't maintenance minded, if they aren't you know, that familiar with electricity and electric usage, you know, you have to keep those factors in mind if they're not going to be living at home and working at home where they can actually manage their electricity. You know, those are some factors to say, okay, well, I need to err on the side of having a larger battery. And then there's the peace of mind factor too. You know, with my off-grid client, you know, one reason why he wanted to design the system not to rely on a generator is he says, hey, I'm moving out to the country. Now, I'm building this, you know, off-grid system, but I don't want to have to listen to my generator running all day long. You know, I don't want to have to hear it because it's loud, you know, disrupt things. But also, if I hear my generator running, I'm going to think, oh, I'm about to run out of electricity, and that's going to be stressful. And so for all those reasons, you want to, you know, not undersell the size of the battery bank to give that customer peace of mind. Okay, so now we're done with the electrical analysis section, moving into battery selection and maintenance. So again, we're going to take another break. I'm going to upload this video to YouTube, and then we'll take it from there.